we'll get started. So thanks everyone for coming today. Welcome to my talk on the social construction of borders. Before we begin, I just want to acknowledge that we're on the unceded territories of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, that is the Songhees and the Esquimalt First Nations. As this discussion will hopefully illuminate, that remains salient despite repeated attempts at genocide and colonization. The borders and boundaries around those spaces continue to be salient, continue to matter, and continue to have political weight and cultural weight. So I hope that we'll talk a little bit about that. So I think we'll shuffle on a little bit. My name is Edwin Hodge. I'm an instructor in the Department of Sociology here at UVic. I also work with the Borders and Globalization project. I have a couple of interests, of research interests. One is gender. I look at the construction of masculinities. So I look at men's lived experiences, primarily in North America. I also look at social movements, so primarily reactionary and extremist social movements of the political far right. So a lot of my research focuses on examinations of neo-Nazism, white supremacy, and increasingly the alt-right. I just had a paper published in the Journal of Borderland Studies looking at knowledge production networks of alt-right activists. So my discussion today is, I hope you'll forgive me, it'll be very similar to the way I lecture. I've been doing that all day, so that's the mode I'm in. And my lectures, coming out of sociology, tend to look and sound a little bit different than perhaps what we've experienced here thus far. So I'm hoping, with your cooperation, they'll be a little more interactive, because I feel that that's part of constructing sort of a productive space. So let's shuffle on, shall we? My discussion today on the social construction of borders emerges largely from my examination of online alt-right and white supremacist networks. Those networks are increasingly important, I think, in the discussion of borders and border theory, as well as in policy, largely because of the ubiquity of online communications. Historically, when we talked about borders, we were largely talking about geopolitical or geographic boundaries. But in sort of disembodied spaces, in online spaces, bordering practices take on new shapes, new forms. They are more what Michel Foucault would call discursive. They are focused on discourse, on establishing boundaries around language, practice, belief, and value. It's also, this talk will also be a reflection of my background as a sociologist. We're primarily interested in social forces as they pertain to collective action, the movements of people, primarily movements of people in solidarity, right, working towards a specific goal. And it's a recognition that borders, as I've said, are not merely geopolitical or spatial in nature. They are, in fact, cultural objects. I hope to convince you by the end of this talk that borders have this added dimension to them, which is every bit as important as looking at geopolitical and physical boundaries, physical barriers. But before we do that, I'd like to do a little experiment, because this is what I do. I call this exercise Thinking of Canada. So if I could ask, maybe just ignore the writing on the screen for a little bit and help me construct a composite image of Canada. So if I were to ask you, and I am going to, when I say Canada, when I say the word Canada to you, what comes to mind? How do you envision Canada? Anyone?
A very diverse country.
A diverse country. All right, so we're talking ethnic diversity, linguistic diversity, cultural diversity. All right?
Think of the map.
A map. Looking roughly like this.
Sure.
Is it color-coded in your head?
No.
It isn't.
No.
What does it correspond to?
Space. Territory.
To territory. Okay. What else?
I'm an outsider For me, it's a welcoming country.
So that's actually a more, for a sociologist, that's the perspective that we're most interested in. So an outsider's perspective of Canada, you see welcoming. So feelings of welcome, feelings of being included. Okay. What else? What else?
Winter, like the song.
Winter. Yeah. Cold,
Yeah.
harsh. Except if you're in Victoria, in which case you get a dusting of snow and the world has ended. Yeah. So we've got a lot of the images that we have in mind. Some of them relate to geography or to climate, but most of what we've been talking about are cultural. In fact, even I'd go so far as to argue with Nicole, even though you talk about the geography, the space of Canada, I think that we might be able to say that is itself you're not really talking about space, you're talking about the representation of space. So when we look at a map of Canada, we're all familiar with this, with the shape of Canada. What we're really talking about is a representation of that geography. Right? No one person in this room, I think, has been everywhere in Canada. No one has stepped foot on everything that can be stepped foot on. So when we are talking about Canada, when we build these composite images, we're actually building a composite of Canada as a culture, Canada as an imaginary or a narrative. In this sense, borders then are less about defining the limits of a state and more about defining claims, defining the boundaries of claims making, right? What counts as Canada? How we imagine Canada, what elements are incorporated into our discussion of Canada, and what's excluded. So in this case, questions of or concepts of diversity, right? Welcoming, cold. There's actually a very long historical tradition in Canada of frigid temperatures being a necessary component of Canadian identity. In the United States, there's a narrative of settlers colonizing the West, right? They go and they tame the West. Americans move ever westward and tame the West. The Canadian mythology, the Canadian myth of origin, isn't about taming the West or settling the West. It never has been. It's always been about surviving the winter. So Canadian stories, Canadian culture is rooted in a mythology of survival, right? In a mythology of toughness. But we also have other elements that we draw in, right? So the out of doors, we have as part of our cultural imaginary this belief that part of what it means to be Canadian, what it means to live in Canada, is to live within this sort of wild, open space, right? We're very proud of our national and provincial parks. We have a lot of our imagery, the way we sell products to one another, is often tied to experiencing the out of doors. Also, we have other images, hockey being a pretty common component. When I ask my students in class, I always get hockey, maple syrup, and moose. Those are the three big ones. Then we get other things, politeness being another big one. Increasingly, we see indigeneity taking a new position in sort of the Canadian imaginary, right? As Indigenous culture, the boundaries around Indigenous culture are resurgent once again, right? Pushing themselves forward into cultural dialogues, demanding that our image of Canada, right, this image we hold in our minds, is reshaped, right, to include them and to recognize our own history as a settler colonial state. But a couple of questions come out of this, as they always do when you're a sociologist. One of the first is, can non-Canadians have Canadian culture? So can a permanent resident in Canada, can we say that they manifest Canadian culture?
I think they can.
They can. So non-Canadians can have Canadian culture. So new immigrants.
New immigrants
Yeah.
become, I think, the limelights of Canada. I feel like one.
Yeah. I mean, we certainly place narratives of immigrants gaining a sense of belonging into our cultural narrative, right? Part of what sort of, if we look at national pride in Canada, Trudeau welcoming in Syrian refugees and welcoming them home, right, is part of our cultural imaginary. So yeah, non-Canadians, it seems that they can have Canadian culture. Yeah.
You talk of cultural borders as being dynamic systems.
Mm-hmm.
So the question that arises in my mind is, okay, then at any given point of time, can you really configure the elements in their vastness or entity, and when does that dynamic, flow, ebb and flow, or whatever that, whichever manner
Mhm.
it happens, where do you then hold on to the identity?
Mm-hmm.
For example, the welcoming of Syrians.
Yeah.
Now that's the dynamic element which is just been added
Right.
by Trudeau, for example.
Yeah.
The way he put it on a tweet or whatever. Okay.
Yeah.
So immediately, maybe it's not a paradigm shift, but it's a significant shift.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah, so Canadian culture as a thing, as a sort of a social object, is dynamic by its very nature. All cultural systems are. So when we see things like the emergence of Syrian refugees, the arrival of Syrian refugees, or the arrival of new diasporic waves of immigrants, we see that Canadian cultural landscape changes, right? But certain touchstones remain relatively constant, or at least have for the past century or so. So we see, sure, with the welcoming of Syrian refugees now, and at other times, sort of the welcoming or the centering of different diasporic groups into Canada. So on the West Coast especially, Indo-Canadian immigrants were once sort of prominently featured as part of the narrative of a changing cultural dynamic, right? And Chinese and North Asian and South Asian immigrants as well. So over time, these cultures shift, right? The boundaries around them shift in response to debates that we have within the culture and outside, right? Debates between sort of our attempts at claiming sort of a cultural space for ourselves and our sort of attempts at gatekeeping who gets to be a part of that. So you're right. The Syrian element is brand new, but immigration's as old as Canada, right? And so while the immediate face may change, those trends and patterns, just in the abstract, remain a part of our imaginary, if that makes sense. Yeah.
What about the exercise of rights?
Yeah.
So when you become an immigrant in Canada, you basically have to go through a whole system of rights.
Mhm.
But once you are a fully fledged citizen,
Yeah.
then there is a civic pressure to be involved,
Absolutely.
to take part. And one of the things that I noticed, which I think is really interesting, is that you have lots of migrants who within their lifetime will become elected officials,
Yeah.
or will become involved in some voluntary societies.
Mhm.
And sometimes, not just at the local level, they become prominent members of society in many different fashions.
Mm-hmm.
Which is kind of interesting. It's a discussion, or it's a discourse, or it's a negotiation between obligations
Yeah.
and responsibilities.
It's absolutely a negotiation, and the heart of that is when we're talking about citizenship as sort of a formal step that new Canadians take. Do we link citizenship with the idea of Canadian identity and culture? And as you pointed out earlier, we actually don't. So citizenship must be something else. It can't just be that the only people who are Canadian citizens, because that's not the case. It doesn't seem that it's ever really been that case, that people can adopt Canadian cultural values. And this is most obvious in the case of permanent residents who've lived in Canada for a long time, but who are not technically citizens. So when we're looking at these debates and these sort of negotiations, part of that is a negotiation or a sort of a cultural debate about what citizenship actually means. Does it mean that's sort of the hard line by which we now say, yeah, you are a part of Canadian culture? Or is it like the last step where we sort of say, yeah, you've done all these other things, you're already Canadian, you might as well just make it formal, if that makes sense? It's an element of a cultural dialogue that is I think, far more wide-reaching than sort of this more formal, like, well, if you go through these steps, then you become Canadian. Right? And that's part of what I'm sort of driving at, is that these claims, these debates around sort of the role of citizenship, or who gets to be a part of Canada, who's a Canadian, who is a Canadian, who has Canadian culture, these are parts of the of claims. These claims-making systems are sort of part of the bordering process of cultural boundaries, right? It's part of the process of generating cultural boundaries, right? Where we delineate which cultural spaces are Canadian and which ones aren't, where there are these liminal or border spaces. And often we sort of simplify it by saying, well, the easiest way is Canadians are people from Canada, right? People who come from Canada. But that's a relatively new thing, right? We are trying to link our cultural identity to both political and geopolitical identities, right? People who are Canadian are from Canada. But the concept of Canada itself is quite new, right? It's a new thing. This is a map of a number of linguistic territories of some of Canada's Indigenous peoples. And as you can see, that map looks nothing like ours, right? That map looks nothing like the map of Canada. It is, in fact, a pre-colonial map of cultural space. We have a myth in Canada. When we look at these earlier maps, we have a myth of Canada as this sort of universalized, this total space, right? What's Canada? Well, it's all the things we drew on that earlier map. It's the provinces and territories. That is a claim being made about the land mass beneath it. But as we can quite clearly see, that landmass has had many maps drawn on top of it. And in fact, this map here remains salient. There are still speakers of most of these languages. The patterns of practice, value, belief within these spaces, right? Within, say, Shuswap or the Okanagan nations, those cultural practices continue to exist. I grew up in a rural part of Canada. I actually grew up on the border between Okanagan and Shuswap territories. They are radically different, right? The language spoken is different. The spiritual beliefs now, after a century and a bit of sort of cultural pressure and attempted annihilation, there's more similarity. But historically, they different spiritualities, different languages, different patterns of practice, different architecture, right? Everything was quite a bit different. So I grew up in a space that for me was just Canada. It was British Columbia. But for members of the Splatson Nation, whose land I grew up on, this Canada, this was something new. This was a new representation. I tell my students a story that I had a friend growing up who his parents would pick me up every weekend, and I'd go and spend the weekend at his house because he was my best friend. And they lived on the res. And so Wayne, the dad, would drive down my driveway, pick me up at my house, and I never gave it any thought. It was just Wayne coming to pick me up. But then as I got older, I realized the land that my family's farm was on was in his time, when his grandfather was chief of the Splatson Nation, that was their territory. He was literally driving onto stolen land to pick up some little white kid to take him back to the res, where the settler colonial state had stuck him. Borders remain incredibly relevant in that space, right? Certainly the Canadian geopolitical border matters, but what mattered even more were these cultural boundaries, right? That I was moving from a dominant Canadian culture to a largely Splatson culture, right? Even within my own small territory. So when I say, when we're talking about Canadian culture, when we're talking about Canadian identity in these Canadian spaces, what are we really talking about? And this is sort of what I hit on. We're actually talking about debates about how to accurately represent the boundaries of Canadian identity, the borders around Canadian space. We have this idea that the land, the physical land around us, is this real thing, what Baudrillard would call the real. Right? It is this real, tangible thing. And what we do is we carve boundaries around that space. Right? We carve that out, and that becomes ours. Right? say that's our space. But the truth is that no one person ever sees all of it. In fact, no one in Canada has seen all of it. So all that we're left with, what we're really debating about when we're looking at maps of the real, when we're looking at maps of Canada and talking about Canadian borders and talking about Canadian identity, what we're really talking about is how we represent that space. We are in fact debating a simulation. Right? We're talking about something that is not the real. Right? It's something else. Baudrillard referred to it as the simulacrum. Now, Baudrillard was one of these crazy postmodernist kind of thinkers, and for him, his argument was that the only reality was in fact the simulation. The only thing that's really real is the representation of the thing, right? Because that's all we're really interested in. So I looked at this and I thought, yeah, if this is true, if we agree with Baudrillard, what we're talking about when we are establishing language laws, when we are establishing rites of passage, when we establish refugee policy, immigration policy, all of these things, what we're doing is we are laying claim to access to not so much the physical space of Canada, but more the sense of belonging in this culture. Right? If you live here, you're part of our culture. How do we handle it? Well, we can't have one-on-one debates with every immigrant that comes through and get them to, do they fit or not? So we have shorthand, and the shorthand we use is, if you're on this side of a line, you can belong. If we don't want you here, you're not allowed to cross. So our borders, in addition to being these physical barriers of entry, are also discursive lines, right? They are points of debate, points of contention between differing identities. So what does that look like in my research? What does that look like in online spaces? Well, it turns out that thinking about borders in this really kind of abstract, sort of weird way is really helpful when you're doing online research. And there's a good reason for that. How do you map territory online? It seems relevant because primarily online social movements like the alt-right primarily or online white supremacy, it seems to matter a lot to them. These groups stake out claims on websites, in sub-communities, on larger websites, and they defend that space. It's not physical space. They're not like, strapping on brass knuckles and going to town on each other over servers. What they're doing is laying claim to digital real estate. And the way they do that is really interesting. They do it discursively. They do it through language. They do it through practice, things like trolling or shit posting, which is a pretty common practice online. And I'm sorry, but that is the official term. And they do it through the spread of meme culture, of memes, right? Which are we're going to actually look at one in a couple of minutes, which I think you'll enjoy. I certainly enjoyed finding it. So let's take a look at one of these groups. So let's look at the alt-right. Now the alt-right does have an offline presence, obviously. Those tiki torches are physical things. So clearly the alt-right has a physical presence. However, the ideology emerged almost entirely online. The ideology, the networks, so the knowledge production sites where they debated, where they came up with their group identity, where they did most of their recruiting, all of it online through social media, primarily Twitter, Reddit, and Facebook. So their whole element of this movement exists in these digital environments. Now, when they do show up in offline spaces every now and then in protests and marches. This was the night before the Charlottesville protest, the Unite the Right protest, which saw the murder of an anti-racist protester. So they do show up in offline spaces, but those that emergence is largely the result of online activity. So who are they? Well, they're largely college-aged men, primarily. College-age men. What do they believe? Well, depends on where you are in the movement. The alt-right is a very strange, sort of a Franken movement. It has elements of anti-immigration, xenophobic populism, the same kind that you see in the Canadian Yellow Vest movement. Xenophobia is putting it mildly. They are anti-feminist, explicitly, and often anti-woman. They, if you go onto their websites, women are often seen as the enemy, or if they're feeling generous, not the enemy, but just a lesser class of person, someone that belongs in the home, largely. They are what we would call neo-traditionalist. They are also explicitly tied to white supremacist organizations. They have ties to the American Renaissance, the Council of Conservative Citizens, Blood and Honor, various neo-Nazi groups around the United States. And then they also have connections to online white supremacist sites like Stormfront, which is sort of a clearinghouse for all things white nationalist. It's a space where neo-Nazis and Klansmen and Aryan nations and skinheads will all hang out together. So how do these groups operate? Well, largely through, as I said, online activism. That is raiding. So large numbers of these groups will coordinate in back channels online or in deep websites that can't really be or you can't really or find them through search engines. So what happens is they coordinate in these smaller spaces and then move in at first dozens of members, but then they'll marshal automated services like botnets or sock puppet accounts that they will raid websites in large numbers designed to overwhelm the site and shut it down or drive its existing membership away to other sites. Yeah.
So, are you contending that people aligned ideologically are equivalent to being citizens of a cultural border? Is
I am.
the contention?
I am in fact getting to that exact thing. Yeah, I think that I think it is imprudent to dismiss that connection, given the ubiquity of computer-mediated spaces, and given the deep penetration of social media and online services into the day-to-day of individuals. For example, my students, the distinction between online and offline doesn't really exist anymore. It doesn't exist. Their online personas and their offline personas, they do not make a meaningful distinction between those two. These sorts of websites, groups like this are bound together by very, very strong ties of ideology. If you spend a lot of time in these spaces, there is an active culture building dimension to what they're doing, where they are explicitly constructing a boundary around that identity, and they hold to it. To the extent that in some of the more extreme cases that I've looked at, nationality, so national citizenship, matters far less than membership in these online spaces. And what that leads to is coordination across borders by these groups. These groups exist in sort of disparate networks spread across the internet. Those borders, those networks ignore borders entirely. But you can find, no matter where you are on that node, no matter what language those people are speaking, the ideology remains the same, and they are effectively communicating with one another in ways that historically we didn't really see, largely because it was more difficult to communicate internationally prior to this. All right, thanks to things like real-time translation services, I can talk to Polish neo-Nazis. Yeah.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Please.
So then, would it mean that maybe the short and definitely the long run, this would sort of clash with the whole idea of geopolitical space?
Yeah.
I mean, and what does it signify? I have no idea.
That's exactly my argument. Is yeah, there's going to this as these trends continue, this kind of identity construction and therefore this kind of boundary maintenance and bordering process is going to become increasingly relevant. So an example, I'll just sort of move to this. An example of that, the alt-right, there's probably a dozen languages, a dozen different nationalities at the very least that are part of the core network. You are very, very likely in a chat room on Discord or Twitch or increasingly in the lobbies of video games. You'll find people from Poland, the UK, Germany, France, Hungary, Canada, Mexico, all talking using translation software, using the sharing of memes, which are these sort of image macros, small images that carry deep cultural significance. They are communicating with each other in a very cohesive kind of way. They're building a shared sense of ideology that ignores borders. And what we see is the ideology and the strategies for activism that emerge in those networks, these transnational, sort of disembodied, aterritorial networks, the only interface they actually seem to have with physical geopolitical borders is when they're planning their actions, when they're planning how they're going to protest. And basically what they do is they'll say, well, in America, the Second Amendment means that I can open carry my rifle in this place. In Canada, you can't do that. So we're going to do exactly the same thing, using exactly the same symbols at exactly the same time, with exactly the same intent, but you don't have guns and I'll have guns. Right? So it's almost the geopolitical and jurisdictional differences become incidental, because the coordination and activation and then the execution are virtually identical. The Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, a couple of months later, there was a nearly identical one in Vancouver. And there was one at the same time happening in Portland. And they look exactly the same. You couldn't tell. If you had a Star Trek technology and you beam someone from one place to the other, you wouldn't know you were at a different rally. It's the same. So the culture that's emerging is remarkably coherent. And I would argue, and I'm hoping to at least halfway convince you that is a salient thing that we have to contend with, especially if we're looking at borders and bordering policy. We have to be able to understand that online bordering practices, in a lot of ways, do not care about the border. And then when we look at darknet activism, that is activism taking place in non-cached darknet or deep web sites, they don't care at all, because legality doesn't exist. So they don't care. The video sharing that exists, the kinds of content that's distributed, it ignores all national, all linguistic, all boundaries. The only culture that matters is the culture they've created. And they guard it very, very jealously.
So then in that case, they do care a lot about borders. They just have a very different sense of what the border is.
Yeah, they absolutely care about borders. They just don't care about geopolitical ones.
Right.
Because, yeah, they sublimate those, yeah.
So, I understand that, but I kind of wonder, just because some of the core principles that form these groups is based on traditional concepts of borders and territoriality, like the anti-immigration
Yeah.
sentiment. So, how do you reconcile that if they are borderless in a sense, but yet it matters so much about where their target audience or, the subjects of their discrimination come from?
Yeah, absolutely. The way that, see, I don't actually have to square it because they do it for me. They're not pro-America, the country. They're pro-nationality, right? And nationality is not linked to geographic space. So for them, they care more about the people, the Volk, right? So they care about cultural purity, right? And they don't actually really care all that much where if they are the kind of ethno-nationalist that wants a state, they don't actually care where that is. It doesn't actually matter to them. It just has to be somewhere. It's you see this goes all the way back into the 1980s when Aryan nation groups entered into a bizarro alliance with the Nation of Islam. So black supremacist activists entered into an alliance with the Ku Klux Klan and the Aryan nations about how to divide up America. And the Klan wanted the Pacific Northwest because obviously it's the best place. So they wanted the Pacific Northwest, and they were happy to give the South to the Nation of Islam. They don't actually care about the geography as much as they care about maintaining the coherence of the nation. So these folks, yeah. If it turned out that someone was able to carve out a niche in, I don't know, Siberia or outer Mongolia, they would not care. They would move because the Volk is what matters, and the Volk is not tied to territory. It's tied to culture. That's how they sort of square that, if that makes sense.
It seems like there's so much value placed in having prime real estate.
Mm-hmm.
There's parts of neighborhoods and cities
Yeah.
and countries, and some are industrial wastelands, and
Yeah.
we see the most disenfranchised populations usually reside there.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's kind of interesting that there's this contention that it doesn't matter, but yet there's wars being fought over
Yeah.
prime land.
Yeah.
So
They're not the ones fighting those wars, though. Like guys like Richard Spencer believe in what he calls a peaceful genocide, peaceful ethnic cleansing, which is like a voluntary mass migration. But as I said, yeah, they may. So if it's hard to describe without reading the literature. If you read, and I'm not talking like this, the social sciencey, I'm talking about their literature. If you read their fantasy, if you read the Turner Diaries and you read their fantasy, the space is always imaginary. It's always pristine and open and rocky. There's the mentions of buildings, of infrastructure is never there. Most of the time it's pastoral, idyllic, and almost off the grid. So
utopian.
yeah, and it's all, yeah. So it's hard to describe. A lot of these guys do not care. They do not care about where they're located as long as they're together. And right now, where they're together is online. And they defend these spaces. They will actively, so they'll use the tools of social media, moderation, suspension, bannings, mutings, that sort of thing, to limit the kinds of discourse that they have, which is ironic given their fetishizing of free speech. But the other thing they'll do is they will post memes. And the memes are symbolic. They're tools that they use to establish the boundaries of basically safe online spaces, right? If a meme like this goes up, and it stays up, that's all they need to know, that space is safe for them to talk. If that meme gets taken down, then they know that that's not a place for them. And they'll either target it as for shit posting and raiding and doxing, or they'll just abandon and just leave it alone. I posted this for a couple of reasons. One, because I'm a very large sci-fi nerd, and so this just speaks to me on a lot of levels. But I am positive the answer to this is no. But does anyone know what that is? Yeah, of course not. All right, so that is Donald Trump, his head anyways.
Yeah.
Now, this meme is called God Emperor Trump. So this is a pretty common meme in alt-right spaces. This is God Emperor Trump. Now, the body, this giant body, this is from a sci-fi game, a science fiction game called Warhammer 40,000. It's set 40,000 years in the future. That body belongs to the God Emperor of mankind, who is the most powerful being in the known universe. So powerful, in fact, that through sheer force of will, he is able to hold together the vast fascist human empire against every alien race. And all alien races seek to destroy and despoil human culture. Does that not sound like pretty basic white nationalism? Right? Racial purity, the defense of racial purity through will alone, right? And giant flaming swords and power armor.
Against aliens.
Against aliens, against this monstrous other, right? So the universe of Warhammer is a satiric. It started as a satire of fascism, right? The good guys in this world are fascists, and it was supposed to be a satire of how ridiculous this whole system is, but it was co-opted pretty quickly by actual fascists and crypto-fascists. So this, the God Emperor of Mankind, the symbolism implicit in this of hypermasculinity, of hyperviolence, of sort of the Nietzschean kind of will to power, all of this speaks to people who are part of this culture. For people who don't have that insight or have that knowledge of what this is just a goofy image. But if you know the lore, if you know what all this symbolizes, this is a really powerful image, right? This is the alt-right telling its members, this is who Donald Trump is for us, right? He's the Messiah who through will alone is going to fix America and eventually bind us all together in this new great culture. And we see exactly that, explicitly that, in alt-right spaces online. So these images are shared around in their spaces, in sort of alt-right strongholds, in places that, these online spaces that are exclusively theirs. This is as common as, it's so common that no one even notices anymore. It's Pepe the Frog, it's the flag of Kekistan, which is like just some symbolist, it's like a vaguely fascist-looking thing from 4chan. It's all memes that have deep symbolic meaning to the group, but don't mean a whole lot to anybody else. They're traded commonly, and that establishes this discursive space. When these groups seek to expand their influence, when they want to move, they will target new websites, target sites that they think might be amenable to them. And so they start sending users who create new usernames, who start putting up new posts that are favorable of Donald Trump, favorable of sort of low-key nationalism, low-key racism. And they do it under the guise of irony. Right? So they'll post this and they'll say, it's over the top. It's clownish. If people on these new websites laugh at them or mock them and are like, this is the dumbest thing I've ever seen, their response is, yeah, it's a joke. It's a joke. Are you triggered by this, snowflake? Look at this joke that I made that you are so offended by. Ha ha ha, I'm trolling you. No one takes it seriously. Except sometimes they do. So if they post this and people don't laugh and mock and are like, oh, that's kind of awesome. Well, now this group knows they've got a toe in. And so they can begin to colonize that space. And that's as good a term as any to describe what they're doing. They go back to their strongholds, they talk to other people, talk to other users there, and the other users create new user accounts on the new space and begin to populate that space with this kind of imagery, with their ideology. It's a process I like to call gradual Hitler, where they start really low-key, just little jokes about immigrants, and then over time become more and more explicit until several months later, a lot of the original users of the website are gone and they've been replaced. Thus, they've colonized a new space. They staked out new claims. And so their network, this node of sites, expands. And it gets pushed back by activists, anti-fascist, anti-racist activists, people who see what's happening online. And so what you end up with are effectively troll wars, are these discursive debates that happen online in places like Reddit, over particularly large communities like the politics subreddit or certain areas on the websites where folks like this, alt-right activists and their opponents, engage in sort of kind of wars of position, right? Sort of to borrow from Gramsci, right? Wars of position, attempting to win the ideological war, right? To convince and recruit. And the point is never to take over those spaces. That's not what they're there for. The point is to use those to generate new recruits that they then cycle back into their safer territory. And so the end result is you have these networks that emerge online. These networks that protect their space by using language, using exclusionary and gatekeeping jargon, things like the God Emperor Trump meme that require a certain amount of knowledge to be able to interpret. Right? They use these tools to carve out a virtual space for themselves. And from that space, what Paletta in one of the articles, the suggested readings, what he calls a free space, that is a site where they're free from persecution and stigma. They use these to generate knowledge and ideology, to generate new ideas and new strategies. From there, they send that out to colonize other websites. And it's happened. We watched, those of us who were researching, we watched this in real time. Alt-right activists targeted a website called the Escapist, which was a pretty popular gaming and sort of nerd website. And we watched in real time as alt-right trolls who were identified by tiny little thumbnail images on beside their username of Pepe the Frog, a little badly drawn green frog. We started watching as their numbers started rising across this website, across the Escapist. At first, it was contained in one small video game subreddit or subforum, but over weeks, we started seeing more and more of these things pop up. They were just popping up all over the place. And then one day, the guy who owned the site said something favorable of the alt-right. And as soon as that happened, all of the progressive content producers for that website jumped ship. All of them. They all left. They went to YouTube. They went elsewhere, Patreon, other places. All that was left were these people that were sympathetic or neutral to the alt-right. By the end of 2015, the Escapist as a website ceased to be anything but an alt-right stronghold. There was only one content producer on the site who explicitly refused to be a part of it. And he had a big enough following of users and subscribers that he was able to more or less hold himself apart. But the rest of the website went alt-right. And it stayed that way until the entire group of owners and operators of the site effectively abandoned it. And it was bought out by somebody else who spent the next several months purging the site of all of those groups. Yeah.
Why should the rest of society be worried about these jokers? I mean, they seem to be jokers.
Oh,
me, at least.
They seem to be
Why-
jokers, yeah.
Why should we be worried about them or concerned or should we be worried about them?
Yeah, we should be. One of the reasons why is because while what they're doing online might seem silly to a lot of us, it has deep significance to them. And radicalization, they're being radicalized in the same way that other domestic terrorist groups are being radicalized. The same patterns of radicalization are there. And the physical outcomes, so the offline outcomes, are remarkably similar. The Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, that horribly violent rally that ended up killing the anti-racist activist, those were mostly alt-right activists, most of those folks. Or they were traditional white supremacist groups that had been welded together using a shared language borrowed from the alt-right. The Yellow Vest movement in Canada, if you look at the signs that they're carrying, at the placards that they're holding, in every rally you'll find Pepe, you'll find some Make America Great Again meme, you'll find the language and the imagery of the alt-right. If you look at neo-Nazi groups that are resurgent, the Southern Poverty Law Center is a group that tracks hate groups in the United States. They've never seen more active hate groups than right now. There's more than 1,000 active hate groups in the US alone. In Canada, we're not immune from that. We see, because of this disembodied aterritorial nature of these online cultures, that ideology slips across the border like it was nothing. So we start seeing, at UVic last year, my students were pulling down posters that said, Jews will not replace us. Right? Swastika was spray painted on the side of the building. The websites on the bottoms of the posters that my students were pulling down directly linked them to the alt-right. They're alt-right websites. New posters are going up all over Vancouver, Victoria, Halifax. It's okay to be white. That's a 4chan alt-right space trolling operation that is moving white supremacist propaganda into the mainstream. So we're actually seeing that these online networks are facilitating the emergence of coordinated offline groups.
So are the police agencies taking watch on these guys?
Yeah, they can. But the problem is that the folks using this technology tend to be a little more savvy about it than. So the RCMP, CSIS, and other groups were observing. They were looking at like Reddit and like white supremacist websites for recruitment. We're trying to monitor recruitment. We want to see where they're recruiting. Neo-Nazis and alt-right weren't recruiting from Reddit and these websites. They were recruiting in the lobbies of first-person shooter video games on Xbox. Nobody was looking for them there. And they were recruiting kids. They were pulling kids into the movement. And they were doing it through Call of Duty. It's not the video games made them Nazis. It's that there's a voice chat service embedded in the video game. And so they would talk to kids in these lobbies. Or you'd go into shared open spaces in MMOs, so online role-playing games, where players can gather in open spaces and talk to one another. Well, they weren't. So neo-Nazis and alt-right activists weren't recruiting through these traditional websites. They were making characters and talking in the town square and recruiting people through online games. No one was even looking for them there. It took informants within the community to let law enforcement know, oh, by the way, you're looking in the wrong place, and you have been for years. So yeah, they're monitoring, but they're always playing catch up. And we're not even talking about darknet and deep web sites that are almost invisible. They're very, very hard to penetrate. So to wrap up, because I don't want to go too long, when we're looking at borders, it's important to remember that borders are multidimensional. They exist not just in the real, in physical architecture, bounding space. They also exist discursively. They are cultural boundaries, cultural barriers. In traditional sort of nation states, okay, these cultural barriers often map closely with the sort of the geographic limits of the state. But as technology links societies, links individuals together, that alignment, that mapping becomes far more diffuse. And as we've seen, as technology allows for real-time, easy, like effortless communication, new cultures are emerging online. And these cultures care about border maintenance as much as anybody else does. And so they are coming up with new tactics, new strategies to construct identity, to build knowledge and identity together, and then to protect that identity from incursion. And so part of the process, I think, of studying borders, I think increasingly is going to have to be studying this as well. I think that border theory in the next 10, 20 years is going to have to take on a pretty radical, there's going to have to incorporate a rather radical new system of investigation. That's it. That's all I got. Thanks everyone for listening and hanging out.